Let it go, make my body go, make our bodies higher and higher.
One of Excel's most creative and powerful tools is called a pivot table. It's a separate entity that you can create based on data. Typically, the data you use as the source for a pivot table is something that's organized like a list, perhaps like what we're seeing here on the screen. If you're trying to analyze this information, you certainly have some tools available on the Data tab. Now, most of them don't let you analyze the data so much, but at least allow you to view it in different ways. This list consists of about 900 rows, information about salespeople who sell certain products to different customers. They can sell to different regions. We're tracking information over a 2-year period. You see the various column headings here. Now, how do you make sense of this? On the Data tab, there's certainly sorting. This could certainly help if we wanted to focus on the products in order or the salesperson. Sorting, of course, gives us all kinds of capability for seeing the data in a more organized way, but no real analytical capability is implied there. A filter certainly helps. We can look at just the data we're most interested in for the moment. Subtotal gets a little bit closer maybe to what we might want to be doing in terms of coming up with some analysis, some totals based on a sorted list, maybe totals by region, by product, by customer, and so on. But trying to make sense out of this in other respects isn't so easy in Excel. Now, one way is to write some formulas off to the right of column H, and I'm making column I a lot narrower now. We've got a table over here. I'll scroll a little bit to the right here. Here's what we might be interested in. We've got a list of all of our salespeople and the various items that we sell, and we're simply trying to find out how many items each person has sold. Now, this is not a pivot table, but we could create something like this by way of a pivot table in short order. Look at some of the formulas in here. They're all pretty much the same. I'll double click the one in K13. Not exactly the easiest formula to handle. I wouldn't call it rocket science or anything like that, but a good, experienced Excel user is going to spend a little bit of time on this, maybe take 10 minutes or so to not only get the formulas down, but to ensure that they are correct. If you were making a presentation of this information too, how easy would it be to change that top row so that we could focus on how many items each of our salespersons has sold to each customer? In other words, could we see the customers across the top? Can we make that switch quickly and easily? Well, if you were the analyst, you might say, well, I'll get back to you in about 10 minutes or so. We'll have that ready for you. With the pivot table, we could create a list like this in about 5 or 10 seconds. And we will be doing this momentarily. But we need to talk a little bit more about what a pivot table is, how we create it, and also about our source data. You can't just say, I've got a bunch of data, therefore I've heard so much about this pivot table feature, I'll just see what a pivot table can do with it. The data that's going to be the source for your pivot table has to be organized as a list. Now, possibly you've converted it into a table. That's not a prerequisite, although it could be helpful. The list that we're looking at here must not have any empty rows within it, nor empty columns. Your headings should be in a single row up top. And it's generally good advice for any list you'll be working with in Excel. Anytime you do sorting or filtering or using the subtotal feature, having your list organized like this makes good sense. If you have any interim subtotals in here, get rid of them. Get rid of those empty rows. If you haven't seen the list in a while, click within it, press Control-A, then press Control-period 4 or 5 times. This will move you around the corners of the range. When you get to the bottom, if you haven't seen this in a while, scroll just a little bit more just to make sure you're not missing any data below. Keep pressing Control-period, it'll take us right back up top. So we've scoped out this list. If you work with the data often, you don't have to do that very often, of course, you would know that this list is together as a unit. So what can we do next with PivotTable? After pointing you to sort and filter and subtotal and reminding you of those capabilities, you certainly would think that PivotTable is on this same Data tab in the ribbon menu system, but it's not. It's on the Insert tab. There is a feature which we'll look at perhaps later, recommended pivot tables, but let's just jump right into the idea that we'd like to see a pivot table. And maybe what we'd like to do is to create a pivot table looking like what we're seeing off to the right here, this list. A quick look at that, by the way, the total is 7,997. And you can see who the best performer is, at least in terms of items sold. Here he is right here, Sam Raimi, over 1,000, the only one over 1,000. So we're expecting to see this list pretty soon. Now, of course, I do need to talk about it as we do this, so it will take a bit longer than 10 seconds. So once we've recognized that our data is in order, and by the way, you might have empty cells in here. That probably isn't what you want, but that's not going to stop us from creating a pivot table. Just make sure we don't have any empty cells all the way across, and we don't in this example. Click on any cell within here. On the Insert tab, the leftmost button. Many times you'll simply click that button and then click OK. The default location for a pivot table will be on a new worksheet, and that's what we're going to do the first time around. Usually you want to give a quick glance here at the table range. Has Excel figured out the extent of your data? It certainly has here. It's saying I see data from cell A1 in the upper left-hand corner down to cell H910 in the lower right. We'll click OK. We're about to see a new worksheet with a pivot table placeholder ready for us to create a pivot table. Placeholder over on the left-hand side. On the right side, you'll see a dialog box, Pivot Table Fields. Now, it might be docked or anchored on the right side, and that's fine. You can leave it there. If you wish, you can click and drag its title bar, drag it out here. You could possibly resize it. Now, you don't really have any rationale for doing this just yet, but as you work with pivot tables, sometimes it's handy to have this closer to the data. But you can move this around a little bit if you wish. If you want it to go back to its docked position, simply double-click its title bar. And for a while, I'll just leave it there. There we are. We see in the top portion here all of the field names that we saw earlier. Now, all I have to do to get this pivot table is first click Salesperson, and two things are going to happen on the screen. Far left, we see an alphabetical list of all of our salespeople. Down below the pivot table field list here, there's a section called rows. Sometimes these are referred to as row labels. And over in the pivot table, which for the moment has no numbers, we see that term row labels as well. I'm now going to click the box for number of items. We're tracking number of items sold. That's a numeric field. It will automatically appear in the pivot table, and we see it off to the left, and also below here in a section called the values area. The wording might seem a little strange, but here are those totals. Remember the 7997 that we saw? And you can see who our best salesperson is. It's Sam Ramey right here. Third thing we need to do is a drag. Simply drag whatever field we want into the columns area. And so if we want to see the products, we'll drag product into the columns area. And there's our pivot table. If we go back to the actual worksheet that we started with here, the creating worksheet, we see off to the right, ultimately, the same numbers. Of course, you're not going to remember them all, but take Dottie Kirsten here, 209, 118, jump back over. Here we are, 209, 118. And all the other numbers are accurate too. We've got a pivot table. And I think you could have imagined that happening even faster had I not been explaining and talking about it along the way. Easy to get to. We've got a pivot table. And need I mention, those long formulas that we saw earlier, not a formula in sight. Not only no formulas here, but no formulas along the grand totals either. PivotTable has done this in the background for us. We've got a pivot table. One suggestion I usually make with pivot tables, and what I usually do myself when I create a pivot table, the terms column labels and row labels, although valuable, and those are terms you want to get familiar with, don't necessarily need to be here. But let me do point out, as we look at the pivot table field list to the right, and I'm going to move the upper part this way so we can see a little bit better. This lower portion of the pivot table is really viable. It reminds us of the layout of the pivot table. And the box here that says rows, in the pivot table itself we see row labels. Rows, or row labels, down the left-hand side. These are in rows. This is referred to as the rows area, or sometimes the row labels area in a pivot table. Across the top here, these are column labels. And that corresponds with what we see in the pivot table fields list in this lower portion, the columns area. And the numbers here are in a section called the values area. Now, if you're working with the data, you're the analyst, you're looking at the numbers, considering some other layouts maybe, it's certainly not going to bother you to see this. And even in some presentation venues, that's not so bad either. But I think most of us would probably rather see either nothing here or perhaps the actual field labels that we see. In other words, salesperson and product. Now, there's something else that you might have recognized. Not only do we have this pivot table fields list to the right, we've got a new ribbon in the menu system called Pivot Table Tools. There's an Analyze tab with buttons related to pivot tables, as well as a Design tab, also related to pivot tables. Click outside the pivot table, as I'm doing now. those disappear, and also that field list to the right. Click back within the pivot table, field list reappears on the right, and we also have our 2 contextual tabs up above. If you don't want to see these terms right here, one option is, on the Analyze tab off to the right, we can simply turn off field headers. I think you could make the case for saying, well, they're not really needed here. We know these are products, we know these are salespersons, so maybe we need nothing. I think a better approach is bring them back and go to the Design tab. And this is certainly not an obvious choice, at least first time around, but if you go to Report Layout, you'll see, and this, of course, would not be obvious either, we are currently viewing the pivot table in what is called compact form. The 2 other forms, outline form and tabular form, actually give us the field headings in place of those terms, row labels and column labels. Outline and tabular are very similar. The major difference is that tabular shows grid lines. There's another difference that we might see later. Tabular form, there we go. With the grid lines, outline without. But more important, I think, to a lot of people, salesperson and product. And particularly if you are printing this, I think you'd like to see that on the worksheet or making a presentation as well. Now, in this look, keep in mind standard Excel features are pretty much available too. We'll click in the upper left corner, selecting the entire worksheet. Double-click any column boundary to readjust the column widths, if that is important. We could also angle the text if we want to. The top row here, that's certainly not critical, but we could do that as well too. We've got good solid information here, and as you'll see in upcoming movies, we have the ability to quickly manipulate this data and display it in different ways. It doesn't take long to create a pivot table. And a quick recap here, going back to our source data on the Creating tab, we simply, first of all, made sure our data was contiguous, row after row, no empty rows, no empty columns. We clicked within the pivot table, went to the Insert tab, clicked the pivot table icon, and from there simply clicked OK. And we ended up on a new sheet. Remember, initially we didn't see anything on the left side, but then in the pivot table fields list to the right, we clicked the box for salesperson, we clicked the box for number of items, and then dragged the word product into the columns area. And there's the pivot table. Fast, easy, and some pretty impressive analysis at our fingertips. We're looking at a pivot table on the worksheet called Manipulating in the workbook 14-Pivot Tables. This is identical to the pivot table you might have seen created in the previous movie. As we look at the field list on the right-hand side, remember the pivot table field list is typically anchored or docked. You can drag it out here. Sometimes this is handy because you want it closer to the data. At other times, you might find that it gets in the way. We can change the size on the top and bottom when needed too. Keep in mind, the lower portion of this is like a map of the pivot table. And as you get more familiar with the concept of the rows area and the columns area and the values area, and as you're working with the pivot table, you see the relationship there. Let's imagine we're having a sales meeting and we've been talking about the numbers here, particularly the highs and the lows, but that discussion has pretty much run its course. And maybe we'd like to see the breakout, instead of by product and salesperson, how about customer and salesperson? So we can remove product from the pivot table either by dragging the word product off the list here, outside of the frame there, that way, or simply unchecking the box in our pivot table field list over here. Let's bring in customer, drag this into the columns area. And now we have the breakout by salesperson and customer. Same grand total and same grand total in all these numbers here, obviously a different breakout. Now instead of products, we're talking about customers. In all of these fields, you can imagine a lot of potential here in terms of what you might be comparing. Another person might say, let's not show the salesperson. Could we see this breakout by customer and region? Are the customers doing better? Are customers buying more in one region or another? Let's uncheck the box for salesperson. Now, instead of dragging region, which I certainly could do, into the rows area, I'm simply going to check the box. Why? Region is a text field, and anytime you check a box for a text field, it automatically appears in the row labels area. That'll be down the left-hand side. So there we see that breakout. Now, somebody in your audience has pointed out, you know, we saw a list like this a couple of years ago. I remember preparing it manually. It took a while. And we had the customer names down the left-hand side and the regions across the top. Can we do that? Now, the word pivot we typically don't really use as we talk about pivot tables, but here's where the word actually comes from. Imagine this list right here. If we could pivot this from the upper left-hand corner, imagine a diagonal line from upper left to lower right, we could somehow twist this and then put these words down the left-hand side in column A, and then these across row 4. Pivoting is not a single action, and as I suggested, most people don't even use the word as they talk about pivot tables. But if we would like to pivot this data, we're simply going to reverse the locations or switch the locations of customer and region. And so in the pivot tables field list, we're going to switch customer and region, and in no particular order. So I'm going to drag customer down and into the rows area, and the interim view has some merit, possibly, sometimes. And now I'm going to drag region from the rows area into the columns area. We've pivoted the data. As you manipulate data here, sometimes the layouts are going to be not so attractive. Keep in mind, Control Z will let us go back, and you can press it repeatedly. I'll press it twice, Control Z. That's what we saw a minute or so ago. And now to reverse stream, I'll press Control Y twice. Now, I'm not saying that you'll be constantly analyzing and second-guessing yourself, but we do have this freedom to suggest, well, let's try this, see how it looks, or try that. Keep in mind, too, as you're doing this, if this is your data, you probably have some instincts about what you're looking for, and although there are many, many interrelationships that we might want to explore here, sometimes you're not always sure, and it's just a good idea, and you quickly get over any timidity that you might have about moving these fields back and forth. At all times, we are not harming the source data. There's always a sense of freedom there, too, when you say, well, gee, could I really mess this up? Could it look awful? Well, that's possible, but you're not in any way altering or threatening your original source data. Now, we can have two fields in the rows area or in the columns area, much more likely in the rows area. Maybe now we'd like to see some relationship between customer and region and product. Let's bring region into the rows area, and then product into columns. I'll drag product into the columns area. Now, it's a busier pivot table. It's got more data. Maybe for a presentation, that's a bit much, but on the printed page, it's not a whole lot. And if you're simply analyzing the data, you're not overwhelming yourself. Keep in mind, there are audiences, of course, who do want to see this much information. And certainly at different times, you want to be thinking about how dense or how crowded a pivot table is. Now, as I click back within the pivot table, recognize what we're seeing for the first time. We've got two fields in the rows area. Customer on top of region in the pivot table fields list, but off to the left, customers to the left of region. And note the correspondence between that. Customer region over here, left, right, in the fields list, customer region top down. Notice also we have subtotals, right or wrong. Sometimes you want them, sometimes you don't. If we don't want them, let's go to the Design tab. Off to the left, subtotals. Let's take them out. Sometimes, of course, you will add them. Same button. Slightly cleaner look. Customer to the left of region. How might that look the other way? Region to the left of customer. In the pivot table fields list, we'll drag customer below region. Just like that. A different look. And it's not always clear which one is better. We could do both. We could go back and forth a little bit with Control Z, Control Y if we wished. But depending upon how you're using this, we don't always need to do that. Keep in mind, again, we can always make some quick adjustments column width-wise. Click in the upper left corner, double-click a boundary between column letters. So we have this ability to quickly change the appearance and move these fields back and forth. One thing you will begin to recognize, too, fields that have more entries are likely to look better in the rows area than in the columns area. For example, suppose I remove product here, and also customer for the moment, and then drag salesperson into the columns area. That's pretty wide. We have to scroll back and forth, even if we adjust the column widths. And so this is going to be much more readable if we drag salesperson into the rows area and then region into the columns area. And you quickly get a handle on that, get a sense of what's going on there. That also reveals some other interesting information. It looks like most of our people sell only in one region, except for Leonard Warren here, for some reason. And of course, you may have known that, but again, we're seeing things in pivot tables that we didn't always recognize ahead of time. Now, I'm going to switch this again, but for another reason. I'm going to remove region, I'll uncheck it, and bring in product. One aspect of pivot tables that surprises people is how we update or refresh a pivot table. Now, in this list right now, I'm going to focus on just a single number for the moment. Sam Raimi sold 199 bamboo end tables. The source data is over on the creating sheet. I'm going to go there. And I see Sam Raimi in this list. Here's one instance of where he sold some bamboo tables. He only sold 3 here. But I've been told that's a mistake. It's an incorrect entry. I'm going to change it to 4. And that would bump up his total from 199 to 200. Press enter. Let's go to the pivot table. Well, it hasn't changed. Isn't this pivot table based on this data? That's what I just said. Yes, it is. But here's what happens. When you create a pivot table, a copy of the source data is stored in an area called the PivotTable cache. That's in the background. And the pivot table is actually based on that. If you change the source data, you have not updated the PivotTable cache. Therefore, this has not changed. It's kind of strange when you think of how we work with Excel otherwise. You learn early on about formulas. Change a cell that's used in the formula. What does the formula do? It reacts immediately. Or if you're working with charts, what happens when you change any of the source data? The chart reacts immediately. Well, what's happening here? We changed our source data. Pivot table didn't react at all. Pivot tables work a little bit differently. If you do change your source data, if you want your pivot table to be up to date, you must refresh it. One of 2 ways: Analyze tab refresh, or Alt F5, that's the keystroke shortcut. Now, we don't have to be situated on this cell, but just keep an eye on the 199. I'll click above it. We're going to update this pivot table with refresh. And now we see the 199 has become 200. You've got to keep track of that and be on top of that idea. The pivot table is now refreshed. Now, there are other things we can do with this pivot table. You'll see that in subsequent movies, but have that sense, the idea that, sure, the pivot table has a certain look right now, but we've got these other fields, and we can view them in a variety of different ways. It's all based on the idea that we might want to analyze this information. And something else we can do, too. We can go behind the scenes. Maybe for whatever reason, one of these numbers or one of these particular items here catches our interest. Maybe we know this salesperson or we're familiar with this item. We might want to track, here's Scott McCullough sold 90 of these chameleon couches. When did that happen, and how often did Scott make a sale there? Double click, and suddenly we're on a new worksheet. Now the total of these items here is 90. We're seeing all situations where Scott McCullough here sold that particular item. Here's the product. I'll readjust the column width real quickly here. Every time Scott McCullough sold chameleon couches, we're seeing those instances right here. And there they are. And the number of items adds up to 90. So back in the pivot table here, the feature, by the way, is referred to as drill down. All I did was to double click. And anytime you want to go behind the scenes, it's like taking a snapshot, going back to the source data. I'd like to see where these 90 couches came from, or in this case, when were they sold. By double clicking, we automatically get a new sheet, and the data is copied from the source data, and we see it right here. It's presented as a table. It's a table layout, the banded row look. And there we have that total. It can be a real attention getter at certain times. That's not its main purpose, of course. Now, if we do other things with the source data and then we refresh our pivot table, this sheet might not be up to date anymore. So you want to be a little bit careful about, if you do want it around, give it a more appropriate name, but also remember that refreshing the pivot table does nothing to these sheets that might have been created earlier. So think of it as a snapshot in time and something really valuable. So we've seen lots of different ways of manipulating the data, gotten familiar with the refresh concept, and also the idea of drill down. We're looking at a pivot table on a worksheet called date grouping. It's based on the data in the creating sheet in this workbook, and if you saw prior movies in this series, you recognize the data. The pivot table field list is off to the right, and right now we're showing date, and that doesn't look very promising. More or less, pivot tables seem to be compact and concise. This one certainly isn't. We're covering data over a 2-year period, and this just goes on and on and on. It's a bit shorter than the source data, but still, not very compact. We'd like to be able to group this data by maybe month, or year, or quarter, something like that. And all we really need to do is to right-click one of these dates. Now, before we do this, recognize that the date here is in the row labels area of this pivot table. You see the check mark up above. There's the date field name. So we'll right-click on one of these dates over in column A, anyone, and choose Group. The prompt comes up saying months, but below that we see quarters and years. Let's just start with months. We could choose all three or any two or any one. We'll just choose months. Watch the pivot table. Immediately, it's very compact. It's showing the breakout by months. This might be all we need to see here. However, those Januaries do represent two different Januaries, and that's not wrong, but on the other hand, we might want to have this broken out by year and possibly even by quarter. So what I could have done the first time, and I'll do it now, I'll right-click, but now we're right-clicking on one of the monthly names. Go back to Group, and this time, click Quarters and Years. You don't need to use the Control key here. We can select these as we need them. Click OK. And now we're seeing the data broken out by years and quarter and date. And notice in the pivot table fields list to the right, years, quarters, and date. The word date for the moment is slightly off. To be in sync with the other ones, that should say months. So we can just click here on cell C4 and retype months. And as I do, keep an eye on the pivot table fields list to the right, down at the bottom here where you see date. That will turn into months as soon as I type it. Enter. There it is. And even in the pivot table fields list, it says months. The original data is not going to say months, it's still going to say date. So we've got 3 levels here of date information. Now possibly that's more than we might have wanted. What if you wanted to make a presentation and preferred to start off with just showing years and quarters? We can take months out of here, but rather than eliminating it, let's temporarily put it into the filters area. Now, in addition to making the list more compact, it also shows above the list an area up here. Now, I don't think that would bother anybody, but that's up there because it's in the filters area. But the focus now shifts to the data here, and we can see the breakout this way. There are those times when you want a smaller display of the data. In other words, not too many numbers at once here. And while you're looking at this, I'm going to try something that might not have occurred to you. In the row labels area of the pivot table fields list off to the right, I'm going to drag years and put it under quarters. And now we see this layout. And that's a bit unusual, but on the other hand, it's valuable because it's showing the 2 first quarters together, the 2 second quarters, and so on. And it's not uncommon to want to be comparing quarterly totals from one year with quarterly totals from the previous or the next year. And so we see those 2 next to one another. And in a similar way, if we were to take quarters out of here, I'll move it into the filters area again, and then bring months into the row labels area. We see this list. That's a fairly standard looking kind of list. But here too, I'm going to put years below months as we did with quarters. And we see this layout. Now, maybe it's a bit busy because of the subtotals. We can go to the Design tab in the ribbon, leftmost button. Subtotals, do not show them for the moment. But now we've got our 2 Januaries together. And there too, sometimes that kind of a comparison makes sense. Let's compare this January with last January or next January, that sort of thing. So we can get some unusual layouts here. And the goal is certainly not to try all possible layouts because there are quite a few. Imagine moving these back and forth, different combinations. So, first of all, for certain situations, maybe the printed page or even certain presentations, years, quarters, months makes sense. Now, what we also have in play here is the idea that with multiple fields in the same group, in other words, the row labels area here, 2 of the fields are called outer fields. You don't see that in the menu system, but the outer fields can be collapsed. For example, we're looking at this data. Maybe for the moment the focus is pretty much on the year 2015. Of course, we could scroll up and down. But since 2014, which is a year, is an outer field, we can double-click it to collapse it, or click the minus, either way. So that collapses into a single row while we shift the focus to the year 2015. We can bring this back, of course, by double-clicking or clicking the plus. Another thought, too, we want to shift the focus to quarters 3 and 4 for both years. I'll collapse quarter 1, I'll collapse quarter 2. And now we see the breakout for quarter 3 and quarter 4 for both years. There are other ways to do this as well, too. I'll bring that back again, this time by pressing Control Z a couple of times. Another option here, slightly different but the same general idea. We could go to the filter arrows here and not show quarters 1 and quarter 2. Slightly different now. We don't even see that there's a quarter 1, quarter 2. Of course, we know that. But we are seeing the detail for quarter 3, quarter 4 in a slightly more compact way. And in a similar way, if we don't want to see 2014 at all for now, we could click the drop arrow next to years right there and unselect 2014. Now, if there's any data before it, we don't want to see that. Looks like there's none in the example here. So we see this data too, this way, just 2015. But we know full well we've got the other data as well. So in varying ways, these filter buttons can be used, or that ability to quickly expand and collapse by either double-clicking or clicking those minuses and pluses. So once again, reversing stream here with some Control-Z's. Bring back the data this way, the quarters, and we're seeing both years as well here too. Now, another feature here that might get your attention at times, and can be a little bit misleading. In the first movie of this chapter, I indicated that with report layout, you could use compact form. This has little meaning until you've got multiple fields like we do now. Think of how wide this list is right now. It goes out to column H, but you see how much screen space it takes up. I'm going to show this pivot table in compact form. It takes up less horizontal space. Now, you might or might not like the display of this. I'll press Control-Z and Control-Y. We can compare the two. Sometimes it's advantageous to have a more compact view. One of the downsides of compact view is you're going to have to manually change these labels or just not show them. And that's why I prefer the other two views. The major difference between the report layouts outline and tabular is, first of all, they have the same general look except that tabular has grid lines. But there is another difference, and if you encounter this at the wrong time, it might be somewhat confusing. Let's say that I want subtotals here for the years. Subtotals, show all subtotals at bottom of group. Well, there they are. We also got them for the quarters too. Subtotal for 2014, 2015. Well, how about the other option? Subtotals, show all subtotals at top of group. And what happens here? Nothing. Nothing changed. Why is that? You wouldn't know this, except from trial and error. Tabular form does not allow us to put titles on top, but outline form does. Now, I made the selection already. I said put these on top. Watch what happens. Now they are on top. Here's the 2014 total on top, not on the bottom. That can be a little confusing at times. And of course, you'll have to decide whether you want subtotals, but you will have the choice of putting them top or bottom if you are using outline form. If you use tabular form, remember that's the one that shows the grid lines, you can only see the totals, subtotals that is, on the bottom. So that's another variation. This grouping capability by date, let's get back to that idea, also has another advantage to it as well. Right now we're seeing years, quarters, months. I'm going to right-click one of the months again and go back to group and take out months and quarters and years and group these by days, but not just a single day. How about 14 days? Based on the idea that maybe in this organization, they tabulate sales for the various managers on a 2-week basis. So now we're seeing the data every 2 weeks. Now, probably what you would want to do is go to a calendar and figure out, first of all, is your 2-week basis, does it start on Sunday? And if it does, you'd want to make sure that your starting date is. So we could right-click one of these, go back to group, and in 2014, the first Sunday of the month was the 5th. So I could start this at the 5th, and I'm going to put it 2014 here, 5th. There we are. And end, it looks like it goes to the end of 2015 every 14 days. So now we've got our data there, starting at the 5th. So these are 2-week periods here. And you can see this. Got about 50 rows or so, because it covers roughly a 2-year period. So some valuable information here and different ways of clustering the data. We could do this on a 3-week basis or a 10-day or a 5-day or anything that seems appropriate for the data at hand. Remember, right-clicking here and choosing group gives us all kinds of options. If we had a transaction file that showed times of day, we might even want to group data by hours and thereby show the busiest hours of the day throughout the year, throughout a 2-year period, something like that. So lots of different grouping capability here. The ability to group information by date is a really strong feature and very easy to get to. And one more thing to look out for here. If the original data has a bad date in it, sometimes you'll do a right click and you cannot group these. And the message doesn't give you a clue as to where that might happen. So be wary of that. The source data has to be accurate. In other words, all dates have to be valid. So if you've got something like November 31st or an April 31st, a day that doesn't exist, if that's somewhere in the data, you're going to have problems trying to group these. So correct the dates if you run into that problem. Otherwise, I think you can say this is a great feature. In addition to grouping data by date in a pivot table, you can also come up with your own groupings. We're looking at a worksheet called Other Grouping. It's in our workbook called 14-PivotTables. And we've got some data here, and we've got our regions broken out: northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. And someone is asking us, can you come up with a total for the east? Can we see this in the pivot table? Well, we don't really have an eastern region. We have the northeast and the southeast. First of all, let's put these together. Now, we don't need to highlight this data here if we want to move it next to northeast. All we need to do is to select its label, and then drag the bottom edge leftward, and the numbers below that, the 284, the 214, and so on, will follow this as I drag just that cell that contains the SE. Drag it over here to the left, let go of the left mouse button, and now they're adjacent to one another. We can highlight these two cells right here, the NE and the SE, right-click, and group. Excel introduces a new row. Here's that group name, somewhat bland. We'll just type in East, much more sensible name, and enter. Notice there's a minus in front of it. That suggests we can collapse it. And over on the right, why not do the West as well? NW and SW, same idea. Right-click, group, and now we see group 2. Let's change that name. Just click there and type West. Enter. Now, before collapsing, look at the data. Here's a 2807, 1243. This is going to go over 4,000, about 4050 or so. We can collapse the East by double-clicking East or clicking the minus, either way. There it is. Same thing with the West. All we got to do is double-click or click the minus. There we are. So we're seeing essentially new data. Now, it's based on our source data, of course, and these totals are the same as the 4 totals that we saw earlier. At least they add up to be the same. But we now have this ability to expand and collapse as we wish. And we got a new name up here called Region 2. And over in the Pivot Table Fields list, you'll see Region 2. That's not exactly very explanatory, and can't immediately come up with a great name here, but how about East-West Breakout or EW Breakout, something like that? Something that you'll remember it by. Something like that, maybe. Now, when these are collapsed and expanded, of course, we see these different views. In the Pivot Table Fields list, and also notice in the lower area here, we've got 2 fields in the columns area. If we don't want to see region for the moment, I'm going to temporarily drag it into the filters area here. We now see East and West without the ability to expand and collapse, and sometimes that might be okay, sometimes not. But we can always bring a region back in here, or if we don't want to use that breakout for a while, either take it off the grid completely, out this way, or put it in the filters area. So we've got some flexibility with this. And we can use the same kind of feature on rows. Both of these items are bamboo. They're both tables, so we might group this under a name like table or bamboo, or since maybe they're living room items, we could put an LR or something like that. Come up with our own name, but the point is we can group these. Right-click, group. There we are, same idea. Instead of group 1, I'm going to call that bamboo tables, maybe. We only have a few products in our list anyway, but just to bring out the idea that we can also group fields here as well. I'll put in LR, meaning living room tables. And we don't necessarily need to do this with the other items, but maybe these 2. These are living room furniture also. Not sure of a good name there, but same idea. Right-click, group, and there we have a group 2. I'll just call it LR furniture. Not quite the best naming convention, but it'll do for now. And we have the ability, of course, to expand and collapse here too, clicking the minuses. So a different kind of list. And you can imagine with different kinds of data how you might want to do that. If you had people's names up and down here, maybe the salespeople like we'd seen earlier, we could certainly bring those into the mix. I'll click salesperson. It becomes a label out here in the row labels area, and the others for the moment, I'll move into the filters area. Some of these salespeople might work out of the same office. Maybe some do, some don't. We can move them up and down, group them in the same way. So maybe Susan here works with Meg, and they're out of the Chicago office, so we could take that, and the data will follow it as we drag it up here. Those 2 are together. Maybe we can highlight those, right-click, and then call that Chicago. They're in the Chicago office, and so on. You could imagine doing that with some of the others as well. So you have this ability, not only with date, as we saw in a prior movie, but with any data, you can group it on your own terms. As you're working with pivot tables, it certainly makes sense at times to see less information, so we've got filters in a variety of locations, and also a relatively new feature introduced in Excel 2010 called slicers. We're looking at a worksheet called Slicers in our workbook 14-PivotTables. Within the pivot table fields list, you'll see a section called filters. It's going to be less important in the future because of this new feature called slicers. But let's talk about how it works. First of all, let's bring in the product field into the filters area. Now, as you keep an eye on the pivot table to the left, look what happens above it. It's actually part of the pivot table, but we haven't used it just yet. It's for product. Let's click the drop arrow here. Maybe we only want to look at bamboo coffee tables. Click there. Okay, that's all we're seeing. And we're reminded of that. We see that in the heading. And of course, the pivot table gets wider at some points, but we're not seeing the total we saw before, not even close to it. We're only focused on one item. And we can certainly go back there and click other items as well. Notice the button, select multiple items. We can click there. We can click other buttons as well. Captain recliner, bamboo end table. Let's look at those three. Well, look what happens right now. This says multiple items. Now, it's been only a minute or so ago, but do you remember which ones we are seeing? Which ones maybe we're not seeing? One of the downsides of filtering at certain times is you want to be reminded, or you want to know what's not being shown as well as what is. And right now we're in a situation where we're not even sure what is being shown, unless it's just very recent. Depends. And what's not being shown, sort of forgot, unless we really know this list well. So, I'm going to press Control-Z to undo this. Before we proceed, we also have a filter arrow here. Here are the customers. Let's suppose we want to see all the customers except Home Emporium. We'll uncheck that, and we're seeing all the others. And the total has adjusted. And similarly, with salesperson, same general idea. We've got control over which ones we want to see at any given time. But again, there's that strong reminder. Let's say we don't want to see John Lucas right now. We don't want to see Robert Owen, so we unselect those, but we're seeing all the others. Which ones are we not seeing again? Well, either we remember or we have to keep going back here. So there are some downsides to filtering. And that filters area, although it can be helpful at times, we do have this problem of not remembering what it is we're seeing and not seeing. So, Control-Z again. Let's bring back all the data. No filtering taking place right now. Slicer is available on the Analyze tab. It's a visual tool. The problem sometimes is it takes up a good deal of screen space. I'm going to insert a slicer for some fields here. First of all, for the fields that are already in the pivot table. Customer and salesperson. Salesperson there, customer there. Those are already in the pivot table. I also want to show, with slicers, product and region. So there's another element of this we're about to see. Let's click OK. Now, if you were making a presentation, ideally you would be doing what I'm doing ahead of time, but I do want to show you how to manipulate these a little bit. They can take up some space, depending upon the field. Move these around different ways. Notice a contextual tab appears in the ribbon. I could go up there and make this one green and this one yellow and so on. Move the product over here. Shrink it a bit also so that it takes up less space. And also salesperson. We can even make these two column if necessary. Not a bad idea here. On the options tab up there, columns to the right, 2. Then we can make this wider. Now again, emphasizing this idea. 2 of these fields are currently present in the pivot table. Customer and salesperson. Region and product are certainly part of our source data, but not in the pivot table. And again, slight color differentiation here just to bring this out. Here's how the slicer is going to work. Someone is asking us to see this layout, but only for the Northeast region. I'm going to click Northeast over in the region slicer, and that's all we're seeing. Some of our salespersons don't work out of the Northeast. They never sell to that region. That's why we're seeing fewer salespersons. And the slicer for salespersons is reminding us of which people are not active in the Northeast, as well as those who are. So they're working in sync. I didn't touch the salesperson slicer here. I made the choice on region. Let's include another region. How about the Southeast region? I'll use the Control key and click the region slicer entry for Southeast. And now what do we see? Southeast and Northeast. Now, as we're looking at the pivot table itself, there's no indication whatsoever about regions. But we can clearly see from the slicers what's going on. Let's go over to customer. Maybe we only want to see the first 3 customers here. Let's click B&B spaces. And then with the Shift key, I'll click Fabulous Homes, and we'll be seeing those 3 together. Now that is being shown in the pivot table, and so I wouldn't call it redundant, but we are reminded, and we were not before when looking at filters in general, we are reminded in our customer list which 2 customers are not currently being shown. So I think you can sense here there's a lot of creativity. It's almost as if you could teach someone who didn't know Excel that well to learn how to use these slicers and actually make a presentation on this data that we see to the right. The icon on the upper right corner of each of these shows the filter with an X, which means clear the filter. In other words, do not filter. Show all of these. At first, maybe that confuses you a little bit, but this means don't filter at all. Show all the customers or show all the regions. If you want to focus on just certain salespersons, that might eliminate some of the regions. So, if you choose Leonard Warren, he's active in 2 regions. Most of the salesperson active in only 1. But holding down the control key now, I'm going to check Norm Traeger over here, and also Dottie Kirsten, there we are, and also Sam Ramey. And we're seeing those people. We see salesperson over in column A, but that's one of the fields that's currently visible in the pivot table, but we also see in the slicers, and we're reminded of who is not being shown here. And we see what's happening in customer and region. Let's only focus on bamboo coffee tables and end tables. So over here in product, bamboo coffee table, with the control key, bamboo end table. The more you work with this, the more powerful I think you'll see it is. But in larger pivot tables with screen space at a premium, remember when you click in the pivot table, there's that pivot table field list. Now you can hide this too if you wish, or move it around in such a way that it's not in the way, but a powerful tool. Starting in Excel 2013, you can also use slicers on tables if you're familiar with that concept, not just pivot tables. But it's a great feature to be using when you're making a presentation to only see the information you want. Remember, these slicers can relate to fields that are currently in the pivot table and also fields that are not in the pivot table and yet part of the source data. You may be familiar with how to create charts to illuminate data. It could be financial data, personnel data, anything. And with pivot tables, we also have the ability to create charts. They're called PivotCharts. They're a little bit different, but pretty much the same general idea. Now, I might not have a pivot table available for this data at all, so I'm going to create one. But notice that on the Insert tab, and not near Pivot Table off to the left, but way over here under Charts, we've got an option called Pivot Chart. Use Pivot Charts to graphically summarize data and explore complicated data. Let's create a pivot chart. Now we will get a pivot table at the same time. Now, we could put this on the same worksheet. I've got data off to the right there, or we'll just put it on a new worksheet. How about a new worksheet? We'll simply click OK. Now, what's a little bit different here is that the pivot chart fields list, first of all, does not say pivot table fields list. Instead of seeing row and column areas, we're seeing axis, category, and legend series here, but think of these as being row and column. So I'm going to check the box for salesperson. We see a pivot table off to the left. We see a chart without much in it. I'm going to check the box for number of items. Now we're seeing a chart that's starting to make some sense. And I'm going to drag the word product into the legend area. The same as dragging it into the columns area. And there we are. We've got a chart. I strongly suggest that when you create a pivot chart, that you consider making it be a stacked column chart. Now, that's not a very large pivot table in terms of numbers there. The chart's a bit difficult to read. I think we can make some sense out of it. I wouldn't call it horrible. But let's immediately note, because it is a chart, we've got a Design tab and a Format tab, just as we do with other charts. So on the Design tab, off to the right, change chart type, and at least consider stacked column. Double-click it. And I think that's a lot easier to read. And we can see at a glance who our best performer is. Now we can see it from the numbers too, but it's Sam Ramey, well ahead of the others. We can see that in the numbers too. A pivot chart is in sync with the pivot table at all times. Nothing about refresh or anything like that you worry about. Any change to the pivot table changes the chart. So if we were to pivot this, I'm going to switch the two fields, salesperson and product. As we do this, watch the chart. I'm dragging product. Ultimately, it's the same as dragging it from column into row, even though the labeling over here says legend and axis. Bring product down here, and the chart for the moment probably isn't so great. Drag salesperson into legend, we see what's happening, and we can see at a glance that the media armoire here is our best-selling item, based on what we're seeing here. Now, what if we didn't create a pivot chart from the beginning as we created this table? I'm going to click the chart and press delete. I'll also change the display over here for a more sensible display, say this one. Now, if this were normal data and you clicked inside and pressed Alt F1, it would pick up the grand totals on the bottom and the right side and display that in a chart. It probably wouldn't be the chart you want. But because this is a pivot table, we can click anywhere within it and simply press Alt F1 to create a pivot table when we need it. Now, I'm not suggesting it's wrong in any way to have created it when you created the pivot table, but sometimes you might want to create a chart later, as we're doing here. And once again, reminder, Design tab, change chart type, at least give it a look. You can see the preview right here. I think that's going to be easier to use and work with. If you've got lots of data in the pivot table, sometimes pivot charts just aren't that appropriate. But I think you can sense here how in some situations a chart is really going to be helpful. And a small tip here with charts, by the way, and there's nothing wrong with these columns. If you happen to right-click one of the columns here, you can go right into Format Data Series, and you'll see an option off to the right. You might have to move the pivot table field list or the pivot charts field list around a little bit. But there's a choice out there called gap width. You might be familiar with this if you've worked with charts. I'm going to change that to be 10%. And just click above it, and you see a difference there. I'm not saying that's necessarily better, but be aware of that easy option to change. Sometimes people like the idea that it's more along the lines of suggesting volume. In other words, they're thicker lines rather than thin ones. So, pivot chart. Remember, you can create it at any time by simply clicking in the data and pressing Alt F1, or before you're creating a chart and table together, you can, on the Insert tab, simply choose Pivot Chart.